Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSüit, and welcome back to another video. And this video is going to be the fourth installment of when 3-bets go wrong. So situations where we 3-bet pre-flop, we probably did not get a fold, and we are having to make some decisions. Sometimes pre-flop, most of the time post-flop. So this is usually a great way of looking at some situations where our 3-bets didn't get the desired outcome and put ourselves in weird spots. And it's always important that we can dig ourselves out of these situations, as 3-bet pots get very, very expensive in a hurry, and whether we had a bluff hand or a semi-bluff hand, it can get kind of difficult regardless. So this video is going to be done in our regular hand history format, so we are going to be using HUD stats and reads when possible to make the best decisions, and I'm also going to give you Hero's HUD stats. So Hero in this video is a 15-13, ATS of 41, 3-bet of 4%, C-bet of 81%, and fold versus C-bet of 38%. So we're just going to run through a collection of hands, have some fun, and talk about when 3-bets go wrong. Okay, this first hand we have ace-deuce, there's a raise, and a call, and Hero decides to squeeze. So in this situation, Afrojacker is a 19-10 over 21 hands, and Rokarian is a 15-13 over 994 with a 3-bet of 4% and fold versus 3-bet of 73%. So in this situation, I usually don't love squeezing, to be perfectly honest, and the big part of the reason is simply because I don't have any information on Afrojacker. I don't know if this is the kind of person who is very likely to fold a tremendous amount of the time, or if he's never going to fold, and also because it's such a small sample over that 21 hands, I don't know if this is the kind of situation where I can c-bet and pick it up a lot of the time, or really have any post-flop idea whatsoever. So I don't love it mostly for that. If Afrojacker was a different player and Rokarian was who he is, I'm totally fine with that. Rokarian's definitely folding versus 3-bet enough of the time for me to like this. And also, just kind of on a nitpicky side, I think that the squeeze could have been a pinch smaller. I think we could have easily done this for 11, 11 and a half, something like that. I don't think we need to go quite so large. I think it's just a pinch unnecessary, but that's just, again, a little bit nitpicky. So we end up getting a call by Afrojacker, fold by Rokarian, go heads up, and Afrojacker checks to us. Hero decides to bet. So, big thing that I'm thinking about here is what does the bet accomplish, as always. So we have our two options here, check or bet. So I'm thinking about, obviously because Hero bet here, we'll talk about that first. So what does the bet accomplish? Is it for value? Is it as a bluff? Obviously, hopefully it's not as a bluff, because obviously we're never folding out a better hand. If our opponent has a set or an ace-king type hand, that's never ever going to fold. Very simple. So that's first and foremost. And if I'm betting for value, my kind of little cheat sheet or my cheat question that I ask myself is, okay, if I bet, can I name at least 3 worse hands that would continue? Because if I can, then chances are it's going to look more like a value bet to me. So in this situation, I think we're kind of struggling to list 3 worse hands that would continue, and continue a very large chunk of the time. Things like jacks, queens, kings. Is that always going to call us? Maybe, maybe not. Really tough to say over only 21 hands. We have no idea how he folds first 3-bet, blah, blah, blah. So this is a situation where I think it's kind of tough to bet for value, and obviously any set, any ace-x beats us, so is there a lot of value to be had here? Now, a lot of people tend to panic between ace-deuce of diamonds versus, say, even ace-deuce of hearts. They think ace-deuce of hearts is way more showdown value, and all of a sudden we have to bet ace-deuce of diamonds simply because it has a flush draw attached to it. Now, don't panic just because you have the flush draw attached to it. Just simply think about the situation, think about what your bet accomplishes, and I really like checking here, because checking allows us to minimize loss when we're behind, and we're certainly going to be behind a non-zero percentage of the time, and it also allows him to bluff the turn. If he wants to do something like that, that's awesome. It also allows him to possibly check call lighter. Maybe if we check behind here, maybe he's more apt to check call something like jacks, queens, or kings on the turn, assuming he's not thinking, and we obviously don't really have any history or dynamic given 21 hand sample size. So this is the kind of spot where I really like a check behind, play poker from there, induce, minimize, kind of all those good things, whereas I don't think the bet really accomplishes much in the long run. So Afrojacker calls, 3 on the turn, he checks, and Hero decides to check back. So as played, totally on board with this. I think it's really difficult to ever think that we're going to get looked up 2 streets by something like jacks, queens, or kings. Obviously, again, I still don't expect to fold out a better hand like an ace-king or ace-queen. So I'm totally on board with the check behind, just kind of play poker from there. And again, maybe you can induce something on the riv or induce a mistake of some sort, so totally cool with that. 7 on the riv, he checks, and hero decides to check behind. So we do end up winning this hand against King Jack, which is always fun, but I will say this. So in this situation, let's just think about Afrojacker's line. So Afrojacker called the 3-bet out of position, check called the flop, check the turn, check the riv. So when he checks the riv, I don't really expect to be behind very often. I don't expect that he would check something like ace-king or ace-queen a large chunk of the time. I think that he'd most of the time probably try to value bet it. So because of that, if you're getting a bit creative or you have some information on that and that he really never has a hand that beats you at that point, the things you could consider doing are shaving your bet size to try to get a second best call more often. So say betting like $18 here, try to get looked up by kings, queens, jacks type hand, or maybe a cry call 9s or 10s if he even has that kind of stuff. So that's just a possible creative play you could consider. As a default, again, I would have played post-flop differently because I would have played that flop differently. It changes the turn and riv a tremendous amount. But also, again, you just really shouldn't be behind very often by the time you get to the river here, so I could consider going for a value bet with some information. As played, whatever, I would make sure that I take a note for sure, that he called a 3-bet out of position with King-Jack of diamonds, that he raised that from under the gun, and I'd also take a note that he did not check bang the flop or check raise somewhere post flop, because I like to know when people play those flush draws really aggressively, even in a 3-bet pot or single raise pot, doesn't matter, I like to know it regardless, and if they don't, then it definitely helps me figure out kind of their check call range post flop, or at least lets me also figure out kind of what their check raising range looks like, if it's going to be more polarized or if it's also going to have some semi bluff stuff in it, blah blah blah. So again, big inflection points here. We're pre-flop as far as should we be squeezing this, and then also a little bit on post-flop, more heavily discussing the flop line, should we be betting it or checking it, what goes into that, and then making obviously great decisions from there. Okay, in this next hand there is a min raise by Alive, and he is a 24-21 over 142 hands, ATS of 52%, and fold versus 3-bet of 33%, and hero decides to 3-bet. So I like the 3-bet, definitely doing it kind of with like a value-ish mindset, so totally on board with that. My only thing that I'm going to say is I prefer the size be just a pinch larger, something like the 8.5-ish, 9 big blind range. I know I've talked before about the default 3-bet size being somewhere between 3 and 3.5x, but when someone opens between a min raise and 2.5x, I generally tend to keep my 3-bet size in my normal range, so the 8 to 10 big blinds. And that's just simply because I want to negate giving them the sickest price in the world, plus position and all that good stuff. So as a default, I'd be 3-betting this just a pinch larger, and it's still definitely for value, don't even question that in the slightest. So here are 3-bets. I actually end up getting called by Alien Lifeform, and he is a 12-9 over 699 with a 3-bet of 5% and fold versus 3-bet of 74%, and Alive comes along as well. So we end up breaking this board and hero checks. So as a pure default, totally on board with the checking behind here. I don't think the bet is going to do a tremendous amount, and especially when someone like Alien Lifeform with those nitty tag stats decides to cold call a 3-bet here, I'm definitely thinking that his range is pretty strong, and I don't expect a lot of it to be folding on this board. Maybe he has the occasional same hand, but even that's discounted just on a combo basis, and thus I don't think I'm getting a lot of folds from him, and I certainly can't expect to get folds every single time from Alive either. So in this situation, totally on board with kind of just checking and playing straightforward from there. And everyone checks as well, catch a king on the turn, and hero decides to bet. So the king on the turn definitely puts me a little bit more in a value spectrum for sure, and I think that if we bet here, we can definitely get looked up by some second best. I don't expect to get looked up every single time by any stretch, but I do expect enough second best to definitely come along here to justify this kind of value bet. So totally on board with that, and obviously if I get called or I face any raises, just going to be making decisions from there. And I'm sure you figured it out, we did face a raise, and we faced it from the weirdest guy here, the nit tag. So he essentially just min raises us here, and kind of the thought process that I take if I'm in hero's seat is, okay, what do I think that he's raising here? Because it's kind of awkward, and the big question I ask is, does he raise king X here? And I don't think that he probably would, because even if he is the kind of guy to cold call a 3-bet pre-flop with ace-king, well, is he the kind of guy that's going to min-raise it post-flop? I mean, that's a little bit awkward. What's a nit tag really expecting to get looked up by? I don't expect he's going to make... I don't expect that he's going to make that kind of min-raising mistake, and thus I think that this is actually just a situation where his raising range becomes very, very polarized. Something like weird pocket threes, some sort of 10x, possibly quads, and really beyond that, I don't expect him to be bluffing a lot either. I don't expect the bottom side of that pole to be really filled with a lot. If he was going to bluff, why wouldn't he have bluffed the flop? Why wouldn't he have taken a stab there? Why would he wait until we lead out on a card that logically hit us? So it's the kind of situation where, yeah, it's a little bizarre, but by the same token, I just don't expect to be good enough for the time here. And yes, we are getting 4.7 to 1, which is a pretty damn good price, but if we're not good anywhere near enough of the time, what's the point in just calling because we're getting a price? And here's the other question. If you call here, pot's going to be very, very large. What are you going to do on the riv? What are you going to do on the river if you face a half pot bet? Not even a shove. So it's a little awkward in that scenario, but when you're dealing against raises from nit tags, especially in 3-bet pots on turns and stuff, I just don't think they're bluffing enough of the time, and because of that, I have nothing wrong with just folding here, even getting a good price. But Hero calls, and you notice that we have roughly a pot size back, and what's Hero going to do on a lot of rivs? Okay, the heart feeling's a little awkward, because now if Alien Lifeform was semi-bluffing weirdly with, one of the... what possible heart hand could he possibly have? Possibly ace, queen of hearts? And does he even cold call a 3-bet with that pre-flop? That's certainly up for debate. And even if he does he always semi-bluff it on the turn? That's up for debate as well. So again, I just don't think that we're doing anywhere near well enough to justify the turn call. On the riv here does end up check folding, even getting 3 to 1, which I'm kind of impressed by. But by the same token, I think Hero could have found this fold earlier in the hand. I think it would have benefited him significantly. And again, I think the big inflection points here were pre-flop as far as the size. 3-bet itself I'm totally okay with. The flop I'm totally okay with. It's just that turn line. It's really awkward. And it doesn't really matter if I face, the min raise like I did, or if he even raised here to something like 36. I'm kind of finding the fold button regardless when that kind of person decides to raise me. As again, I just don't expect to be good enough for the time, and thus I don't think Hero should be wasting his time with a call in that situation. Okay, in this next hand we have ace-king again. There's a raise by Tom Tizzle, folds around, and Tom Tizzle is a 55-32 over 44 hands, and we actually don't have any fold versus 3-bet stats on him yet. So in this situation, Hero decides to 3-bet, and I can go either way in this situation. To be perfectly honest, I like calling this a fair chunk of the time. It is the bigger open raise size from EP. It's the kind of situation also where, say we 3-bet to roughly the size that Hero did, what we're creating if Tom calls is a situation where we're roughly at 2 SPR. Roughly 25 in the middle, roughly 50 effective back. So it's a situation where it's 2 SPR. And then I ask myself, do I want to create a 2 SPR pot out of position with ace-king? I don't mind playing a 2 SPR pot with aces or kings, obviously, but it's a little bit different when you have a hand that's going to miss the flop roughly 2/3 of the time. And then I'll also ask you this, do you want to do a lot of bluff c-betting against this guy? No, probably not. And also, is this the kind of guy that if you do end up checking a flop that you miss, is this the kind of guy who's probably going to be betting that a lot of the time? I'd say probably yes. So it's a kind of situation where I'm thinking that step ahead, and I'm really thinking ahead. I'm thinking about, okay, how often do I hit, and how good is that going to be? How often does my hand miss, and can I make money? Can I bluff c-bet? If I check, is he going to bet? aka, do I ever win that pot, or do I end up check folding a large chunk of the time? So those are kind of the questions I'm asking myself in a situation like this, whereas had I just called here, then all of a sudden the pot's give or take around $9 in, 62 back, give or take, so that it's really deep. We can actually play some poker going into the flop, and I don't have to feel so committed. So those are just some things I like to think about. I don't just want to auto 3-bet because lols I have ace-king, and I know I've talked about this before. It's the kind of situation where I really don't mind flatting it sometimes. And yeah, I'm out of position. Yes, I'm still going to miss the flop 2/3 of the time, but it's a situation where I expect to perform just fine if I do decide to just call here and play poker. But hero does 3-bet, so it is what it is. And I'm not saying I never 3-bet. It definitely depends a lot on who the player is, his fold versus 3-bet stats, what I'm 3-betting it for. Is it for value, semi-bluff, blah, blah, blah. And then kind of also the post-flop idea, especially if I'm thinking forward and thinking about what is it going to look like if he calls SPR-wise and such. And the other thing I'm also thinking about is if I 3-bet, is he the kind of guy who's going to do it like 4-bet ship his entire range? And obviously I'll snap that if I think I have an edge on it. So those are some things I also want to be thinking about. So Tom calls, and we do end up bricking, and in this situation, hero checks, which, like I said, I expect to miss the flop a lot, and I also expect that I'm probably going to do a lot of check folding against a guy like this. He's definitely fishy. He raise called from EP. He opened for a larger pre-flop raise size, so this is just the kind of situation where I'd probably say forget it. I'm not really that interested. I don't think I'm going to perform well enough, and I think hero's playing the hand just fine right now. Tom checks behind, which is a little bit weird. So when someone like that checks behind, I'm not sure if he's just kind of not interested in the pot anymore, if all of a sudden he's playing really scared. It's kind of awkward, but also difficult to sell because he's a fish, and who the hell knows how fish think? They don't even know. 4 in the turn, same concept for hero. We have a bluff hand, we have a little bit of equity, whatever, but I also don't expect that if I bet I'm going to create a lot of folds, and because of that, I'm totally on board with this. And also think about it this way. If Tom were checking behind something like, say, King-Queen or Ace-10 or one of those kind of hands, and he didn't bet the flop, I don't expect he's going to bet the turn a lot of the time either. So it's kind of one of those situations where when I'm ahead, I expect to be able to show down a fair chunk of the time and also win, which obviously I'm totally cool with. And if Tom even has, say, something like pocket threes, I still don't expect it to really fold ever. But Tom does check behind, king on the riv, and hero decides to lead out. So at this point, totally on board with this, roughly a half pot bet, trying to get some value from Tom, so everything's looking good so far as I'm concerned, and Tom decides to roughly mid-raise it. So at this point, we're getting 4.3 to 1, only have to be good 19% of the time at a minimum to break even, and hero decides to go for the call. And I like the call in a situation against someone like this, just because I don't expect him to really have too much, and also there's the possibility that he's raising something second best on the riv. You know, raising like a King-Queen or King-10 type hand or something silly, possibly the same hand, or just taking some really bizarre bluff. If he had a real hand, a set, or even a King-Jack type hand, I expect that would have bet somewhere along the line, so I don't think he's going to have that kind of hand on the riv. And if he has some weirdly played set, there aren't very many combos of it, and thus I'm really not that worried about it. And because he's a fish, it increases the chances that he has something stupid and is making some mistake, and thus I'm way more likely to call it off, especially getting a good price in a situation like this. So we do end up winning, and I would definitely make sure that I take some notes here. He opened 10-9 off from early position. He did that for 4x. He called a 3-bet out of position and played a draw really weirdly. So these are all notes that I would take. This isn't the kind of guy I expect to hang around for a long time. And for the record, it does kind of change the way I'm going to be 3-betting him in the future. I'm going to be obviously 3-betting him with a lot more value stuff. And also things like Ace-King, Ace-Queen start to get shifted more towards value against a player like this. Even hands like Queens, Jacks, that sort of stuff. So definitely make sure you're paying attention to that. Again, position does factor into the pre-flop decision as well, as far as when I was talking about 3-betting it versus flatting it. And again, the big inflection points here, pre-flop especially, should we 3-bet it, should we flat it, what goes into each. And then post-flop was kind of fine. River was a little bit weird facing that raise, but like I said, I'm totally on board with hero's call here. I expect him to be good, plenty enough for the time. And of course, at the end of the day, just make sure you take a note and then adjust in the future. Okay, in this next hand, there is a raise, there's a call, and there's another call, and hero decides to squeeze. So, 4s is a 15-11 over 947, fold versus 3-bet of 82. Oslov is a 10-7 over 1.2k with a fold versus 3-bet of 13%. Rags is a 12-8 over 1.5k hands with a fold versus 3-bet of 95. And the button is a 27 over 197 with a fold versus 3-bet of 60%. So, in this situation, I can totally be on board with the squeeze. Now, I do want to say a couple things. One is the big person that I'm really paying attention to is who opened, which is 4s, who is a taggy guy, very high fold versus 3-bet percentage. Happy about that. The Oslov guy with the fold versus 3-bet of only 13%, I don't think that 13% is quite real. This is a kind of guy who does not get involved very often pre-flop, which means that his fold versus 3-bet stat is going to be heavily determined by essentially by the way that he opens and faces 3-bets. He doesn't open very often. When he does face a 3-bet, usually he's very strong, so he's not going to be folding versus 3-bets very often, which is definitely going to skew his number. He also might call squeezes a little bit lighter, but I don't expect him to call such a large one. So if he has something like a small pocket pair, which is pretty much exactly what I expect him to have, I don't expect him to be calling 3-bets very often. And then the only other person is the button. Yeah, he's not my favorite person in the world to squeeze, but by the same token, I don't expect him to call every single time, and if he does, I at least have some equity that I can go to the flop with. The only thing that I'm going to say in this situation is I think that the squeeze size could have been a bit smaller, probably something in like the 15 and a half range. I don't think it needs to quite be 17 and a half. Not saying it's the worst thing in the world, I just think that it's kind of unnecessary. But in this situation, we do end up getting looked up by my Nissan and go heads up to this flop. So here decides to lead out here for 27, can totally be on board with that. I think that we can definitely generate some folds here. Things like pocket eights and down I expect to fold. Things like ace king, ace jacky type hands missed, so I expect that those will probably fold a lot. So this is the kind of situation where I'm totally on board. Board's paired, which also makes it difficult for him to continue, especially when it's paired on the high side of the spectrum. So totally cool with this. I do expect to generate enough folds, and if he calls, I always have some equity. I can just go forward from there. But we don't get a fold because God forbid that ever happens, and we pick up a dirty 4 on the turn, and hero decides to check. So totally on board with the check here. I don't think we can really bet and expect to generate a tremendous amount of folds. Unfortunately, this is kind of one of those situations where I expect that he's probably going to shove, and I'm just going to have to fold because I don't have proper equity getting roughly 3 to 1. So kind of is what it is. However, in this situation, that is not what happened, and we actually ended up facing this stupid little $12 bet. So at this point, we are getting 9.2 to 1, which is an absurdly nice price, and only need 9.8% equity in order to break even. Now, if we assume that most of our 9 outs are live, we can roughly estimate our equity, taking that 9 times it by 2, because we have 1 card to come. So at this point, I expect we have roughly 18%-ish equity. Even if we discount some of our outs, assuming sometimes we're dead and we're going to pay off on them, say maybe we only have 6.5 outs, that's still fine given the price that we're getting. So this is like the easiest call in the world in my opinion. I wouldn't check shove it, only because I don't expect to generate any folds by doing so. So I would just kind of check call here, take my price, and hope that I bank on the riv, and just make a decision from there. So very easy. Unfortunately, Hero decided to fold here. Not 100% sure why. He may have brain farted. Could have been a number of different things. So I definitely, like I said, I would personally just be check calling that turn, playing poker. I thought the squeeze pre-flop was okay. I thought the c-bet was okay. The only thing that I'm going to say is, again, I think being a little bit nitpicky as far as the pre-flop squeeze size. And then the other thing is I think the turn just needs to be a check call and, again, play poker from there. I think this is a very, very easy situation. Hero just kind of slows down, doesn't get pissy that he missed his flush, and then just going to, snap check fold mode. I think this could have been played a bit better. But like I said, big important parts were pre-flop and the flop line. Both of those I thought were okay, just being a bit nitpicky as far as sizes. Okay, this next hand, it folds around. I wear shoes opens, and he is a 17-15 over 957 with an ATS of 55% and a fold versus 3-bet of 86%, and Hero decides to re-steal. So totally on board with this. This is the exact kind of person that I'm looking to attack with a lot of light 3-betting and light re-stealing, are these people that have high opening ranges, so high ATSs when they're coming from steal spots, aka he has a large O range, and that he has a tight C range, aka that he's hitting that fold button a lot, he's not 4-betting or calling that 3-bet a lot, and when someone has a fold versus 3-bet of 86%, that's very, very indicative that he's going to be finding that fold button a tremendous amount of the time. So because that totally on board with this, I'm certainly not going to flat ace-8 suited, I don't think it's strong enough to do so, so I would just kind of 3-bet. If I happen to get called, I'll make it post-flop decisions. If he happens to 4-bet me, probably going to be finding the fold button a large chunk of the time. Very, very easy. And just one more thing is I would definitely want to make sure that I take a note on who Karista is before I go for this kind of 3-bet. I just want to make sure that this isn't someone who's going to be calling it every single time, just essentially making sure that he's not an absolute fish. But if he isn't, like I said, totally on board. So we go heads up to it, and of course we catch the worst flop ever, and Hero decides to bet. And the reason why I say this is the worst flop ever is because it really should smash a lot of what I Wear Shoes would call with a 3-bet. I expect his call versus 3-bet range is going to have a lot of double Broadway stuff in it, and obviously all of that catches at least a pair on this board, if not some sort of pair and draw, if not a straight, if not a set or 2 pair. So I just don't really expect to create any folds here, and yeah, I don't really even think I can double barrel this board a lot of the time, because what am I going to do, bet here and then bet a lot of turn cards? Am I really expecting to generate a lot of folds? Well, when his call versus 3-bet range is so strong, and this board should be smashing it, and thus his call to C-bet range should be really strong, I don't expect a lot of dubs to work. So like I said, this is the kind of spot where I would be playing a little bit more straightforward, just kind of saying, okay, well, the 3-bet failed, it happened, so right now I'm kind of in a situation where I just want to check fold and say forget it, rather than just burning more money. But he C-bets, gets called. Deuce on the turn, here decides to check, and I'm totally on board with that. Again, I don't think I can really do a lot of bluff dubbing against this guy. I don't expect him to be folding, and thus I'm not really going to be betting that deuce. So in a situation like this, I think Hero played a turn fine, and he faces a bet, and at this point Hero's getting 3.1 to 1, and Hero decides to call. So it's a little awkward as to whether or not I want to call here. As always, and I mentioned this in the past, I always want to think about what my improvement cards are before I do anything with the draw. So my improvement cards in this situation, of course, are clubs, and maybe an ace is good once and never, and a jack gives us a straight, which is cool. But a jack also puts a 4 straight on board, so we're probably not making much, if any, money there. The 9 of clubs has the same predicament, and the ace also puts a 4 straight on board, which again is why I don't expect to win with that card either. So we're not really getting proper price here to justify this call, and thus I'd be saying, okay, well, do I think I can get paid on the riv when I hit? So if I call here, makes the pot pretty large, and it's less than a pot size bet going in the riv, so maybe I can get that shove called a large chunk of the time if I donk shove on a club. Okay, that's certainly something I could think about, but is he always going to call it? That's up for debate. So again, these are the kind of questions that I'm asking myself. I assume that we can probably do enough in implied odds to justify this call, but again, I really want to make sure the Hero's playing the flop a little cleaner, because that definitely sets up for more profitable turns and rivs in my opinion, and also I don't expect to see a lot of turns rivs if I check the flop, which I'm okay with. So in this situation, Hero does decide to call, and again, I think this is okay. I think we can make enough on the rib to justify this, shoving roughly 60 into 90, so I do expect this to be fine enough, especially because a lot of our cards are hidden, like, you know, the 4 of clubs or the 7 of clubs, that sort of stuff. I expect that it's going to be profitable enough, but I don't expect it to be the most profitable thing, and if the math was any different, say he had, potted it on the turn, obviously I'm just going to be finding that fold button. But in this situation, we catch an 8 on the riv, Hero decides to check, and just check fold. So I'm totally cool with that at that point, of course. It's just the big things to take away from this. The 3-bet, really, really good, I like that. The flop C-bet, I really don't like that. I think the texture is horrific for it. I don't think we have really any dub potential. And on the turn, it, as played, just became that math decision. Getting 3 to 1 is not quite good enough. We probably need something closer to 5 to 1 or 5.5 to 1, so we need to be able to recoup that missing price on the riv, and I think it's possible enough. But again, big things to take away with the draw are, what are our outs, what do they do to the board, is that good or bad as far as getting us paid off, and then just making decisions from there. So these are just kind of the little things you want to be thinking about when you're making these decisions. Again, I think the hand could have been played a lot cleaner, pretty much just all post-flop, but as played, at least Hero found the fold button on the river, that's definitely good, but I think he could have definitely check-folded that flop and not felt bad about it at all. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we looked at a collection of situations where we 3-bet pre-flop and we usually got some sort of action and had to go post-flop. And a lot of these situations are pretty common. The semi-bluff, the semi-bluff squeeze, the 3-betting pre-flop with something like ace-king. And these aren't really rare situations, they come up quite often, and I want to look at some situations that are more common. So catching, single top pair, also things like whiffing the board and how we want to react when we whiff, what kind of considerations we're looking at, and really at all times it just boils down to ranges. Who is our opponent? How does he call versus 3-bets? How does that kind of range hit the board texture? Do we think that we can generate enough folds from it? Or if we're value betting, do we think that he can continue with enough second best? And then, of course, just making decisions from there. So as always, if you just classify your hand strength, think in terms of ranges. And again, we also talked about some pre-flop stuff. Should we have even 3-bet this in the first place? Could we have done something slightly different, like a different size or something? Could we have flatted versus 3-bet, blah, blah, blah. It's all important, but by the same token, it all boils down to ranges. What is his range when he opens? What is his range when he calls 3-bets? Or will he call 3-bets often or not? Blah, blah, blah. And then, as always, just make the best decisions from there and think about EV and think about how you're going to make money. And when appropriate, think ahead. Think about the SPR you're creating. Think about the kind of folds you can generate now and or later. And then just go forward from there. So same as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck playing your 3-bet pots.